Conquering empires is easy, maintaining them is even harder. So today we're going to get into topic 3.2, the empire's administration. How does the empires that we've been talking about with the land-based empires and the gunpowder empires especially maintain their control over their territories? What strategies do they use? And so that is going to be what we'll talk about with today's topic. With our central questions, identify and explain two ways rulers of the land from the land-based empires consolidated power. So how did they become more centralized, in other words? And then identify and explain two ways rulers in land-based empires legitimize. How do they legitimize their power, their rule over the people during the same period of 1450 to 1750? So those are things to keep an eye out for evidence of in the course of today's lecture. So some context, throughout times, empires have always relied on centralized control over the empires, and they've used a variety of methods, some of which will continue into this era. Some of them will be new innovations of how they gain control and hold control and legitimize that control over time. So this is something that we'll go into a little bit into today. And so we're going to start off with what is the first part of this lecture, is the recruitment of the use of bureaucratic elites, as well as the development of military professionals became more common among rulers who wanted to maintain centralized control over the population. So this represents more of a change that is occurring in the empires that we'll talk about, and compared to other periods of history as well, and how empires maintain and control and legitimize their power. So here's some powerful monarchs of the early modern empires. And so we'll talk about some of these today. Some we've already talked about in previous lectures as well. But this is something that we'll kind of go into more detail, starting with England. So England is going to be ruled by kings, and there's a long history of England having many kings. Really the England that we know today starts with William the Conqueror, as we've talked about in previous lectures. But as time goes on, there are going to be different families that will end up holding the throne, and one of those families is known as the Tudors. And the Tudors come to power in 1485. And they'll hold it until 1603. And there's a lot of Tudors that are come about that many people know about today. Henry VIII is one that's most famous, and everyone knows him as the guy who ends up having multiple wives, 5 to be exact. And that is something that we can talk about in class or another time. But there's also,
Attention, the Golden Gold Ticket email just went out. Make sure you check your email. Again, the Golden Gold Ticket for a ticket to the girls' competition, the girls' soccer game, is the Golden Gold Ticket. Email is out. Go find that golden ticket. Thanks, everybody.
Start. All right, so the Tudors themselves also included Elizabeth I, who was probably the most powerful of them, and certainly one who makes a huge impact. But there's also Mary I. You probably know her as Bloody Mary, and why she's called Bloody Mary. Well, I'll tell you about that in the next lecture, so stay tuned for that. But they would use bureaucratic elites known as the justices of the peace. These were extremely loyal individuals that their job was to maintain peace and kind of set up a legal system to enforce the king's law, the king's or queen's, and so simply the monarch's law. And then under the Tudors, they also, the feudal lords that had been holding power for a very long time in England, they began to weaken, and more power is shifting to the Parliament, a advisory body and also legal body of the government that was established back in the 1200s. And originally it's used to help advise the king or queen to deal with state matters, also to hold some power so that the power of the king was not absolute. And so Parliament during this time becomes more powerful. And one of the things it does during the era of the Tudors is it establishes this idea of individual rights. As citizens of England, living in England, Englishmen and women, well, mostly men, had the certain rights that can't be violated without due process of law. And so that's something, the English Bill of Rights is something that is important to note, because today it definitely inspires other Bill of Rights, including our own. of the idea that individual liberties must be protected by the government. So we're going to switch over to Russia, and Russia is another example. They continued to use this feudal order that had been established. I mean, we're the last of the Western European countries, and I would consider Russia more Western European than I would Asian, but they are kind of that in between, and they continued to use this feudal order. And one of the things, I mean, they had lords who had land, and they were landowning elites. They were known as the boyars, and the boyars were, they had a lot of power because, when you're talking about such a vast land that Russia is, it's hard to control that land. And really what you need was the boyars to kind of be there to manage and oversee the land. But because of that, they had a lot of individual power, and that sometimes conflicted with the emperors that came to be, including Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible had some tensions with the boyars as they kind of wrestled for power with each other, which led to open violence and wars, which Ivan the Terrible eventually becomes victorious. And in doing so, he forces the boyars to move to St. Peter, to Moscow, where he was the capital and held his power. And he did so because he wanted to keep an eye on them. And he, of course, invites their families, too, so that he can keep an eye on them. So essentially holding them hostages almost. If the boyar needed to go back to his land to kind of manage, then the family would have to stay behind. They were almost like essentially hostages to make sure that if you were to raise an army against me again, then I have your family. So that's something that they did to kind of centralize power. He did to centralize power and so forth. He also created a paramilitary force known as and I'm going to mispronounce this, the Opechinya. Russian's not my forte. So, but this was a paramilitary force that almost becomes the beginnings of what is the secret police in Russia. And they would carry out to be extremely loyal to the czars, including Peter the Terrible, Ivan the Terrible. Peter the First comes around though, and so he's going to continue to consolidate power. He is going to be in a competition for power with his sister, Sophia, who was backed by the boyars. But they had a military elite known as the Streltsy. Again, Russian, not my forte. But after they defeated the forces, after Peter was victorious in the struggle for power, he disbands that military elite, and he also puts his sister into a convent where she would practice Eastern Orthodox religion for her rest of her life. Peter also used religion in a way to kind of defend his title and so forth. And so he was originally known as the defender of orthodoxy, as he kind of pushed missionaries to spread it out throughout the lands. But the clergy does get upset with him when he does try to make some changes that would give him more control over the church and so forth. That was something that comes up in Russian history. If you ever take a Russian history class in college, I'm sure that will be something that will be more and better explained. But he reorganizes the government, and this is all going about centralizing control once again, right? He is going to create a government where government officials will be paid by him through his treasury, and he would give out a salary rather than giving out land like in previous generations and through the feudal systems themselves. And so because they no longer have that land, they depend on that salary, which makes them easier to control. There's also a Senate and a council to advise him that were created, but they also they would rule in his stead if he was off abroad for diplomatic reasons or on vacation for going hunting or whatever. So that's something else that he reorganizes the Russian military much more so. And it's all about centralizing power around him. He is the one in control, and that's how it's going to continue to be in the following rulers of Russia after Peter the Great. All the way to the Tsar Nicholas II, really, which is the last Tsar. Okay, so now we're on to an example that is specified in the curriculum for AP World History, Ottoman Empire and the Deshmir system. The Deshmir system is something that is going to be used. It's an adaptation to a previous system that was used by the sultans in previous generations. But Deshmir means selection. Now, it is essentially slavery. And because of the system, or not system, but in Islam, slavery, to enslave somebody who is a believer is considered, wrong. It's a taboo. Okay, so what ends up happening is that during the course of the Ottoman Empire and the lands that they conquer, they're going to conquer different people, including Christians. So in southern Europe, what is now modern day the Balkan Peninsula, as well as Greece. That land was largely occupied by people who practiced Christianity. And so the selection of people that they needed to help run the government and were essentially slaves was done of these Christian communities. And so large conquered Christian communities were required to hand over their quota of young boys, in roughly about a fifth of the population, in which they would be taken by the Ottomans, by the state, and they would teach them. They would put them into state-run education systems. They would teach them Turkish. They would teach them art, philosophy, a whole array of things, and they would educate them to eventually become bureaucrats that would help become government officials that run the empire. And even some of them do convert to Islam down the road, but they were really dependent on the state because they had taken from their homes, so they depended on the state to feed them, to clothe them, to house them, and all the other things, the essential necessities for life. But even then, like, being part of this system was allowed for some sense of social mobility. And so even some families would willingly give their sons this opportunity to become something within the empire, rather than just living at home with them, where they were largely farmers and miners and all those things. So those are some things that it's kind of an odd system. It is slavery, as we kind of define it. It is coerced in some way. Many of the people that were taken in the Deshmir system were also become the elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, known as the Janissaries. And the Janissaries, they were extremely loyal because of that whole the way the system works. But they were because they were so loyal and because they depended on the state so much, they were the primary users of firearms and gunpowder weapons within the Ottoman Empire. Because they depended so much on the Ottoman Empire and the rulers themselves, they would likely not turn against them. Of course, over time, the Janissaries do figure out, hey, we're the only ones that own gunpowder weapons, and they were barred from being married. And so that was something that they're like, we would like to be able to do this, and we do have the guns that kind of back this up. So over time, the Janissaries are able to carve out nice little pockets of power within the Ottoman Empire. Something of will probably play a role in the downturn of the Ottoman Empire, and we'll talk about that later on in class. So here's the Ottoman Janissaries as they were dressed and such. I mean, they're really crisp uniforms. I mean, not really functional, as you can probably see them marching down the roads and such for ambush, just kind of like the British soldiers, right? But in those days, it didn't really make as much of a difference as it would in today. And so, you see these really well-dressed, pristine soldiers, and they can mark fear into an enemy's our hearts and minds. So that's something that they were extremely good soldiers, and a big reason why the Ottomans are able to hold the territory that they do for a very long time. So we're going to move over to East Asia, the Ming and the Qing dynasties. And so the Ming dynasty was what replaced the Yuan dynasty. And remember, the Yuan dynasty was the Mongols. And the Mongols had a distinct way of ruling, where they brought outside administrators, especially from Persia, because they trusted their ability to govern and govern fairly, more so than they relied on the old Song dynasty officials. So once the Yuan dynasty is gotten rid of and the Ming came back to power, they reestablished some old traditions that they had done before, including the use of a professional bureaucracy. A professional bureaucracy that also required young men to take an exam, the civil service exam, that would be the qualifier whether or not they were allowed to serve. So this was something that they did, and just kind of it's a continuity of periods in the past, but it's a change from the Yuan dynasty, which had a different method. And then we move into the Qing dynasty, which the Qing dynasty, when it comes about, they saw the bureaucracy as widely corrupt. And that was something that happened throughout history in the Chinese government, is that over time, those bureaucrats do become corrupt, and they will take tax money and use it for personal purposes. And so maybe one of the reasons why the Ming dynasty didn't fully fulfill the mandate of heaven, as it were. But when the Qing dynasty and the Manchus, as they are, come in and take control of China, they replace that bureaucracy with a very strict military control. And just to kind of give you a general sense, they had this system of 8 banners, and each banner was a different color, and they represented the armies in the Qing dynasty, and then they would have different responsibilities. For example, like the green banners, the Green Army, their responsibility was to maintain peace and control over the territory. So if there was rebellions against the Manchus, then they were sent in to help put those rebellions down. And this is how the Manchus and the Qing dynasty maintained control over their territory, despite the fact that they are kind of considered as a foreign invasion to many of the Chinese, the Hans that were already living there. So we're moving on to Japan, still part of East Asia here. Japan, while this is not necessarily specifically given as an illustrative example in College Board, it is important to note because we're talking about how military or how bureaucratic elites, consolidate power in the different empires. And so Japan is part of that at this time. So during the time of this 12th to 15th century, they were largely run by shoguns. And shoguns were these military leaders that pretty much took control of Japan. Despite the fact they have an emperor, the emperor represented more of a symbolic leader and a religious leader than it did as a state leader. And so the shoguns are going to take control. Meanwhile, because Japan had been using a feudal system for a very long time, you had the emperor, you had the shoguns, and you had all of these lords that controlled the different parts of Japan because it's a very big island and multiple islands to boot. And so these land-owning elites were known as the daimyo. And the daimyo would become kind of the de facto leaders of Japan. And they did have to report to the shogunate at times, but they still held a lot of individual power and control over their territories, and largely because they all employed their own private armies, which were the samurai. And so the samurai, were loyal to the daimyo, and the daimyo had to be loyal to shogun. Now, over time, there is going to be some changes that occur, especially in this period. And one of them, and oh gosh, I should have looked up the pronunciation of this before I did this, but Oda Nobunaga, he is going to be one of very powerful daimyo who takes control of Kyoto, which was the capital essentially of Japan at that time. And from there, he would then push control and take more control of lands from different daimyo surrounding that. Up until the time that he passes, he controls roughly 1/3 of Japan's land. And the others are going to follow after him, will take more and more control of Japan's lands as we kind of know as Japan today. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu, he is going to come to power, and this begins the time period known as the Tokugawa Shogunate, where he is going to be the powerful military ruler over Japan, and he oversees this time in Japanese history known as the period of Great Peace. And during that time, they are going to centralize more control over the feudal system. The daimyo are going to have to learn to take orders from the shogunate, and they also divide up this land into these different territories known as Hans. Each Han is controlled by a daimyo, But again, to kind of centralize that power and that rule, the shogun, who was essentially running the show, required that all the daimyo had residence in the capital of the Tokugawa shogunate, which was Edo, or Tokyo today. And they were told they had to bring their families with them. And so just similar to what we talked about with Russia, the fact that they brought the lords to the Winter Palace, where they stayed, to keep an eye on them, and if they left, the daimyo, if they had to go back to their lands to manage their lands, the families would stay. So it's still a kind of a semi-hostage type of situation, and it's how you prevent them from being able to rebel against your rule. Part of this whole Tokugawa shogunate was the idea and the use of the salaried samurai. And, this is read, so it is an example from College Board of an illustrated example. And so, once these samurai were considered elite, and they were they had a lot of power and stance within the empire of Japan, and they were rewarded with different pay, similar like rice as well as land and so forth. But over time, during the Tokugawa shogunate, they increasingly became not just warriors, but they also became couriers and bureaucrats, and they also became, just essentially government officials rather than just exclusively soldiers. So, because of that, they do lose this kind of prestige and rank within the social order of Japan. And so that is one major change that occurs, is the samurai kind of shift from being these elite warrior class of people to government officials. And while they are not the bottom of the totem pole, there was some sense of loss of the social order of old. Then we're going to move on to the Mughal Empire. And so this is something we will talk about a little now, and we'll talk a little bit more later. But the Mughal Empire was probably best organized under Emperor Akbar. And Akbar establishes a very efficient government, and he creates this very fair justice system, and even when he himself would rule on any particular court case or something along those lines, the people still had the right to appeal his decision to somebody else. So, this was something that is really important, because remember that Akbar is a Muslim leader, and he's controlling a territory that's largely Hindu. And so he had to create some sort of system that the people who are Hindu feel that they had fair shot in control, or in this system that was largely run by Muslims. So he also establishes government officials known as zamindars, and we will talk more about them later. They are going to run the civil service. They're going to run the bureaucracy of the Mughal Empire. So we're going to just here's a nice little graphic provided by Ben Freeman and Freemanpedia. We've talked about janissaries, zamindars, and we'll continue to talk about them. The boyars, the bannermen were essentially what we talked about with the Qing dynasty and the Manchu Empire. But the Safavid, the Qizilbash was another example that I didn't do a whole slide on. But essentially it was a group of Shiite Turks who had an allegiance to the Shah, who was the leader of the Safavid Empire. And they would view him as divine, as like representative of Allah on earth. And so that gives them some sort of extremely loyal service to them. And they were essentially a military elites that helped maintain control over the Safavid Empire, and also helped them expand it too. All right, so we're moving on to the next part 2 of this whole administrative empires. If you want to stop and take a break, feel free. This is going to be a semi-long lecture, but rulers continue to use religious ideas, art, and monumental art to legitimize their rule. It's a continuation. So when we talk about change and continuation through history, all empires have used these methods and different ways to try to legitimize why the rulers should be the rulers. And so we'll talk about some examples here. So we'll start with the Mexica practice of human sacrifice. So the Aztecs, we talked about this in the past. They use human sacrifice, in a lot of different reasons. And so, in this sense, to legitimize the rule, these priests who are practicing the human sacrifice are legitimizing they should continue to rule, because in doing so, they are maintaining the balance of the order of life, the balance of the celestial bodies. I'm probably way oversimplifying this, but the understanding is that they continue to do this so that the sun would rise and the moon would be here and so forth, and that is why they did it to begin with. So there's disagreements with the historians of legitimacy of this whole why they do it, but it does chorus this obedience to the state. And it does give a legitimate power and prestige to the priest and the elite class of people that lived in the Aztec Empire. So an example of how religion is used to legitimize the rule of the people, of the rulers, I should say. So next we move on to European divine right. This is something I do want to extend on a little bit more so. And so one of the things that was understood by the people is, why do the kings rule? Why does that person have authority over me? And a lot of it goes back to this idea of divine right. So this concept that the king's authority comes directly from God. And how does God choose? He's the leader. They're born into it. So if they were born into this family and they become the king or the queen, then it was God's will that happened that way. And so if God's willing the leaders to rule, then it's almost like they're ruling on behalf of God himself. So this is something of a concept that will get challenged later down the road. But for now, in this time period, monarchs had virtually unchecked power because they were seen as the earthly agent of God. Something that kind of resonates more in some spaces or some places than others. But it's a tradition that goes back to 800. Charlemagne, who is going to essentially be endorsed by the Pope as being the legitimate ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, or the Frankish kingdom at the time. But this is something that continues on, and especially with French kings. The French kings will rule with this idea of what's called absolutism. They have absolute power and authority that cannot be challenged, because to challenge the king is to challenge God himself. So this was justified by the use of religion. Christianity and the Catholic Church especially backed these rulers up. And it was something that each one of them, when they become to power, that they looked for essentially the approval of the Pope and of the Catholic Church, that they are the legitimate rulers of their countries and their lands. So even though the separation of church and state happens inside Europe to an extent, meaning that unlike in, say, the Darul Islam and the rule of the Abbasids, the ruler of the religion is different. In Europe, the ruler of the religion is different than the ruler of the state. But the rule of the religion, the Pope, has to legitimize the rule of the leader of the state, of the king or queen. So that's something that is very much how religion plays a role in influencing and legitimizing the rule of the kings and queens. Louis XIV is the example I kind of put here. He is the one who really coins the idea of absolutism and uses the divine rights theory to legitimize his rule and allow him to spend gobs of money on monumental architecture, some of which I will show you later. Okay, so another example of how art is used in a way to legitimize the rulers. We'll start with the Qing imperial portraits. Again, this is an example that's given by College Board that we should cover. And so the Forbidden City, which was essentially the place where the emperors lived in the Qing dynasty, they would put these portraits outside of the walls of the Forbidden City, and they were to represent the emperors themselves. And each one of them kind of are drawn or painted, I should say, in a way that gives the people the sense that this person should be the legitimate ruler. And so the example we have here is Emperor Kanji. He is going to have this painting adorned on the Forbidden City. And there's a lot of little symbols in here, much of which I'm not going to get into. But you have this book here. And the book itself is a symbol for scholarship. It was important for the people of the Chinese civilization to have a lot of respect for people who are well educated. And being well educated kind of gives them that sense that they know what they're doing, right? We would expect the same thing from our leaders today. We don't want somebody who has no experience or who's not well read and learned in whatever you want them to be. And so because of that, like this scholarship idea, it goes back to Confucianist traits. Remember the civil service exam. You have to have a great deal of understanding of Confucianist principles and so forth. Later, with the Song Dynasty, it wasn't just Confucian, it was also Buddhism, it was Taoism, it was Christianity. You had to have this understanding. It's a Confucian trait of being well read and understood, and so that is in this portrait portrayed there, and again gives them sense of legitimacy of rule over the Chinese people, help maintain the idea of the mandate of heaven. All right, so we're moving to South America and the Incan Empire, and so the Incan Empire is you got lots of examples, but the one that College Board wants us to tell you about is the Incan Sun Temple of Cusco. And this has come up before. It's this the church right here, Santo Domingo, is built upon it, but this down here was once the temple of the sun god, which was Inti. And Inti, remember, is essentially the main god in the Incan religion. And the Sapa Inca, the rulers of the Incan Empire, were said to be the representative Inti on Earth. And so having built this giant temple to Inti kind of legitimizes the rulers rule over the people because they are paying homage to the god that they believe is the most powerful. On top of that, the monumental architecture of that time was pretty impressive, and so you built like a very impressive, beautiful, whatever monumental art and such. Then it shows the power and resources and creativeness of the rulers in a lot of ways. So it helps further legitimize their rule. The Sun Temple itself is not the same today, obviously, as it was back then. There would have been also a ton of metal work made from silver and gold that would have done inside the temple and within the gardens that were surrounded the temples. And it's not there anymore because when the Europeans arrive, they take all that silver and gold, smelt it down, and then they do what they do with it. But that is something that must have been a sight to see, and to see something so magnificent gave the people a sense that these people know what they're doing, right? So we're moving on to another part of the world, back to South Asia. And so the Mughals, who built mausolea and mosques that helped kind of legitimize their rule, and they built these magnificent architectural wonders, some of which are still around today and still protected by the UNESCO World Heritage Organization, and so that's just something everyone knows. It's Taj Mahal. Okay, so Taj Mahal was built by Shah Jahan, and he built this as a tomb to his wife who died during childbirth, giving birth to 10 plus kids. I can't remember how many it was, but this took years and years and gobs of money and artisans and artists, just engineers to be able to build this, to be able to get all of this resources together to build something so beautiful. It gives that idea of power that they can wield these and further legitimizes their rule to the people. You have Taj Mahal, but it doesn't end with this. There's other amazing architectural works that the Mughals do, including the Red Fort. And so this was a fort that was built in which the Mughals held power in. And looking at it, I mean, it's a pretty beautiful fort. I've seen some ugly ones. I mean, this is a pretty beautiful fort. And it sits there on the landscape, and people can see, oh man, that is power right there. To be able to build something so powerful or beautiful, to be able to yield all those resources to one spot to build, and the people they needed, it just builds up, right? Humayun's tomb. This is another mausoleum where it was built by the Mughals. The Badshah Mosque, which is in current day Pakistan, another example of something that was built by the Mughals in their time during as they ruled India or South Asia, really in general. So then we also move on to European palaces, other examples of monumental architecture. And these are essentially the homes of the emperors and the kings and queens of these countries, of these empires, these civilizations, whatever you want to say. So this is the Winter Palace. This is in St. Petersburg. This was built by Peter I. And the amount of money that he used to build this was ridiculous. And it's going to come back on him at some point, and especially on his future czars. But living in such a lavish lifestyle, and then you have all of these peasants and serfs who are really scraping the bottom of the barrel for things, really doesn't help the Russians in a lot of times in their history. But Peter I built this because he wanted to, again, kind of become more like Western Europe, where they're building large palaces as well, including Potsdam, which Potsdam is found in Prussia, or where the Prussian Empire and emperors lived. Today, it's kind of about 30 miles outside of Berlin. I've actually been here. It's really amazing. And this is not just like the only palace. There's like 5 or 6, I think I visited. There's probably more. It's where like the emperors would leave Berlin, and they would come out here, and it was kind of like their little hunting lodge, a vacation for the weekends. But the amount of money and resources that got put into building all of these is so impressive, and gives you a sense of how legitimate their power was. The Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Austria, another beautiful architectural wonder, another something that sits on the cultural landscape, and to live in something so big and so powerful legitimizes a rule. But the one, if you can't remember any of the other European palaces, the one you should remember is Versailles. Versailles was the biggest and probably the most lavish of them all. It's 712,000 square feet big. And this was a place where it was built by the French kings, King Louis XIV, and then the 15th and the 16th live here. And if you know a little bit about French history, Louis XVI is the last true French king, as kind of using that idea of absolutism. But he built this palace to accommodate his family, himself, and of course the lords. And so once again, it's just kind of similar to Russia and Japan, to keep control and centralize control over his lands. And he had the lords come stay with him at court, as well as families, so that he can keep a closer eye on them, and he can control the lands of France even more so. The Ottomans are also, even though they're not specific examples from the College Board that they say that you should talk about the Ottomans, you can't ignore them. They also use monumental architecture, and they build mosques. They build mosques in celebration of victories and conquests. And mosques are really important. It kind of blends the idea of religion, where the rulers of the Ottoman Empire are also kind of the overseers of and protectors of Islam. So building mosques and spaces for people to be able to worship helps kind of give them something that they want, as well as shows off their power and prestige as well. So you have the Mosque of Selim. You have this, which is known as Faith Mosque, and you can see just how beautiful they built these. You have, great art inside each one of them. This is my favorite here, is the Blue Mosque. And there are more official names to these than what I'm providing for you. But here's like a mosque that uses all this blue kind of turquoise color. I don't think it's turquoise. I think it's azul. I'm not sure. But yeah, this has all of this gorgeous art in here and so forth. It's so amazing. And again, resources. Bringing artisans from all across your empire to build something like this just wields that power. Here's Mosque of Suleiman, another magnificent art, a piece of art and so forth. And here's another mosque that is built by the Safavids, the Mosque of Isfahan, also known as the Shah Mosque. And so this is another example within the Safavid Empire that they use monumental art in a way to legitimize their rule. So I've mentioned all of these here. One I didn't mention and do a slide on was the Ottoman miniatures. And these were just miniature paintings that were done by the Ottoman sultans. Oftentimes the miniatures would depict, rulers in a way that legitimized a rule, like, they, holding court and leading the people. Oftentimes they were showing military conquests and the great victories of the sultans. So those are just another example of art that is used to help legitimize rule. We also have religious ideas. Talk about the divine right theory. I talk about the Aztec sacrifices. The Confucians, they had these rituals that would be done by the emperors. For example, like there was a temple, essentially a temple for the harvest, in which the leaders of the Manchus and this has happened in the past, would essentially they would be the first ones to plow the land in front of that temple and then plant the seeds, and then everyone else was allowed to do it after that. And so if you're talking about like the idea of legitimizing rule, like you can't start planting until the emperor does it, and that says a lot. Songhai Empire is another example of an empire that comes during this time period. Then the Songhai Empire adopted Islam and used Islam to legitimize the rulers and such. Of course, they built the mosques, those mud brick kind of mosques that we've seen in previous lectures. And the Safavids used Shi'ism, which was a minority branch of Islam, to legitimize their rule, and so they were the defenders of Shia Islam, against stuck between the Ottomans and the Mughal empires. So they used that as a way to kind of legitimize their rule as well. All right, so we're on to the last section. And again, if you want to take a break, pause, continue it. This is a long lecture, but it's really, really important. All right. But rulers used tribute collection, tax farming, and innovation tax collection systems to generate revenue in order to forward state power and expansion. So all of these things that I've been showing you, these great mosques and palaces and so forth, it costs a lot of money to do that. Where does it come from? Here's how. All right. So Russia, they are going to do their own tax system as well. Peter I, he essentially tries to industrialize his country, try to catch up with what the Western European countries have done. He was especially impressed with the Dutch and their power of their shipyards. And so something that he pushed for was the building of these shipyards. He also pushed for the building of mines and so forth that would be under state control. He also encouraged private businesses to industrialize as well. And then he would, of course, tax them to collect money. But over time, that did not bring back the financial gains that he had hoped. And so he ends up kind of using a quasi-feudal system that would allow him to move workers within the country, and especially bring them into the urban areas to help run these state-run industries. And then he also replaced taxes on individuals with taxes on land. And that really made it difficult, especially for the peasant class of people in Russia, to be able to have any type of social mobility, because land was really important, and it is still today. But when the government's taking land away from you as a form of tax, you have less land to grow things on, you have less ways to make money, and that is something of a burden onto the peasant class and the serfs, especially within Russia. Something that, again, Russia has a hard time maintaining, how do I put this, peaceful coexistence with the peasants and the people itself. Another thing, and it's not something that's going to be related to College Board, but I just think it's fascinating, is that Peter himself also put a tax on beards. And so wanting to try to westernize more so, he wanted to, and this was kind of especially an Eastern Orthodox tradition, to have these very long, unkept beards for the most part. And that is something he wanted to get rid of. So he created this idea of a beard tax that you had to pay if you wanted to be able to keep your beard. And the boyars, they wanted to continue those traditions. And so the boyars basically would have to pay a tax if they wanted to keep a beard and so forth. So just an interesting side note with Russia and their taxation system, right? This is an example that is provided by College Board as something that we should cover, and it's the Zamindars of the Mughal Empire, which I talked about earlier in the lecture. The Zamindars were essentially the ones who helped run the civil services of the Mughal Empire, and they were kind of an intermediaries between those who were being ruled and the rulers themselves, essentially aristocrats. And their job, one of their jobs, was to collect taxes from the peasants. Now, in doing so, they got to keep 9 or 10% of those taxes they collected to help fuel their own kind of expenses and so forth. And the rest of it would go to the Mughals that would distribute it however they saw. And so it could be paid in forms of crops, rice, pepper, which could be used to trade and make currency from. But the taxes that they were keeping, taxes were being kept by the Zamindars rather than given to the state, because there was no way of unless you completely trusted the Zamindars to be legitimate, there was no way to keep track of how much they were getting and if they were giving the right amounts to the Mughal emperors. Enter Emperor Akbar, who changes this system, and so he would establish these state-controlled markets in which the peasants could go to these markets directly to sell their crops, and then they would sell it for cash and make money that way. So this was a way that, they would sell the cash, and they would take the cash, and they would pay their taxes directly to the Zamindars rather than to the government rather than the Zamindars. So it kind of cuts out that middleman. So this is another example of how they're centralizing their power, but it's also an example of how they're getting money to be able to pay for all of those beautiful forts, mosques, and mausoleums, right? The Ottoman tax farming is another system. It's known as the Itzelam system. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right, but basically included farming and land taxes, the farming and urban taxes, and then also production of certain goods. So tax farming, it sounds like you're taxing the farmers. It's just a way for them to collect taxes, and they would have individuals that would go and collect the taxes on behalf of the Ottoman sultans. And so this video has already gone long enough, and so I don't want to explain this anymore. But if you want to know more about this, and I really do encourage you, check out the video. I'm going to link to the Canvas page done by Freemanpedia about Ottoman tax farming. Ben Freeman does a good job to explain how that system works. And it's another example of how they were able to collect taxes with a new, innovative way. The Mexica tribute system and the tribute list and such, this is something we've talked about in the past, how they required tribute from the surrounding peoples of Tenochtitlan. And so, they required tribute to be paid about every 80 days, 6 months or 12 months, depending on what are the goods that were on these lists that they must pay. So whether it was, leopard skins or feathers, or beads or whatever and such, they had to have these tributes that they must pay. and they were collected by the people known as the Kalapiske. This was kind of a way for them to legitimize the rule, once again, because you had to pay essentially the tax man. If not, then there were problems that are going to come down your way, especially with the powerful military the Aztecs had. The tribute system itself, it's kind of something that is more taught and told through the eyes of Europeans and European scholars that come in the wake of the destruction of the Aztecs. But from most understanding, the tributes and such that they had to pay were generally reasonable and weren't overtaxing, so to say. But again, when the Europeans arrive, surrounding villages and people that were being taxed and had to pay tribute did seem to want to get rid of the Aztecs and help the Europeans do that. Last but not least, the Ming practice of collecting hard taxes. And so this is kind of, again, the Ming dynasty was the one that replaced the Yuan dynasty. And the Yuan dynasty used reliance on paper money, something we've talked about in the past. But they printed so much paper money that it ends up causing inflation. And then the Chinese economy starts to take a total downturn during the 14th century. That, combined with the bubonic plague that hit China, really caused the Yuan dynasty to lose that mandate of heaven. And that's a big reason why the Ming dynasty comes into power. And so once the Mings are in power, they began to combat this hyperinflation that was created by the overprinting of money, and they switched to a tax practice that mandated that people pay taxes in the form of silver and coinage. And so, like, here's some examples of that down here. In order to pay the taxes, they had to actually have silver and so forth. And so they would get a lot of this silver through Japan and the tributary system of all the silver mines that were in Japan. But the demand for silver continues to rise and rise and rise and rise for Japan as a result of that. And so when we get into our next period of history, our next unit, you'll find that China does find more silver that will come from the Andes region and the Incan, once was Incan civilization. And when the Europeans are going to take and mine a ton of silver, that'll eventually find its way in Japan because of the demand for more silver. So this becomes a part of essentially a world currency, so to say. Also to note, the tributary systems still continue to some extent within this period from the Korean and Japanese civilizations as the Ming Dynasty came into power as well. Oh, that's it. That's a lot. I know. But all really important stuff. I mean, we're talking about how empires are conquered. It's even more important to find ways to how do you maintain that power and control over that territory. And these are the ways that the land empires did so. So after going through all that, I hope you have enough information to answer these questions. And make sure that you are staying on top of your readings. And we're on to 3.3 next time, which will be the last topic area. It might be short in terms of topics, but there's a lot to cover in each one. Anyway, that's it for Mr. Henry's classroom. I hope to see you all later.